So I've already put my title up here and I underline that for you. The key to shutter speed is understanding how a photograph is really not a moment in time but a period of time. And so I'll try and explain that a little better. When the shutter is open, the longer it's open, the more it exposes the sensor, or in the old days the film, to the light. And so it's part of exposure, and it's one of those three things that we talked about when we talked about exposure. So it is part of getting exposure correct. Now, in most cases, shutter speed is the main variable that affects exposure, and if you want to add or subtract exposure using exposure compensation, the camera usually alters the shutter speed to do that. So it's really in many ways the primary method of ensuring that you get the right exposure in the picture. But it is one of three methods. We talked about aperture in another video, and there's also sensitivity. So it's possible to choose a shutter speed if you so wish and use the other two variables to attain the right exposure. So it's only one of the three. Now, to understand shutter speed, you have to sort of understand its effect on a photograph. And so shutter speed can be thought of as a duration, a period of time, or it can be thought of as a fraction of time, a fraction of a second, and that's the way that we normally express shutter speed, is in fractions of a second. Now it can be expressed in seconds if it's a really long exposure, but it's usually a fraction of a second. Now where things get a little bit confusing is the camera sometimes expresses fractions of a second without the fraction. So where you might have an exposure of 100th of a second, which would normally be 1 over 100, the camera might just display that in your viewfinder as 100. And it's not saying 100 seconds, it's saying 100th of a second. If I was to look at 1/500th of a second, which I would normally express as 1 over 500, the camera might show that as 500. Now, although 500 looks like a bigger number than 100, it's really a smaller number because it should be expressed as a fraction. So 1/500th is a shorter duration, which we might say is a faster shutter speed. So that's faster, okay, than, for example, 1/100th of a second. When things get really long in duration, like close to a second, the camera might start expressing things like you might have 1/4 of a second might be expressed as 4, but then 1/2 of a second might be expressed as 0.5. So the camera might switch to using decimals when it gets close to 1 second, and then in numbers of seconds after 1 second, if you had 2 seconds, it might use like a little quotation mark to express that this is 2 seconds. I'm not sure if sometimes the quotation mark might be behind it. So you're going to have to understand what those, what the camera is displaying and what they mean in relation to like seconds and exposure durations and that kind of thing. Looks like I should have used a harder brush when I was wanting to erase this stuff. So that's how the camera might display time or shutter speed, shutter duration. But what does it really mean to the photographs? So I've got a few examples up here. So this picture was taken, well, let's see, I'll make sure I get the right ones. Yeah, so this picture was taken with 1/50th of a second shutter speed, so that's 1 over 50. It was taken with a standard 50mm lens, so I'm just going to write 50mm up here. Now what that refers to is the zoom or the focal length of the lens. Okay, and that's going to be important when we talk in a minute about limits. So this was 1/50th of a second. It just so happened that the amount of light I had and the sensitivity I was using and the aperture I was using, this was about the right exposure. So I've got some bright highlights and some dark shadows in here. The exposure is about right. But it was 1/50th of a second, and that was fairly quick. It's a fairly brief, short moment of time. But if I was to use a smaller aperture or a lower sensitivity, I might end up using an exposure which in this case was, I think, 1/4 of a second, 1/4. The camera might just have shown it as 4, but that's a much longer period of time, and it was so long that the camera was shaking in my hands a little bit. Now in this case I kind of wasn't terribly careful with it. I wasn't trying to hold it too terribly steady, but there was enough camera shake that this blurred my little salt and pepper shaker subjects, and so you're left with what you might just call like a throwaway image, something that you wouldn't really want. So this was undesirable. Still using 50mm as the zoom or the focal length. Now I have another example here of using that same 1/4 of a second, but with image stabilization or shake reduction as an example of what shake reduction can do. But I'm gonna put some warnings on this in a minute. It's not as sharp as the correct image at the nice fast shutter speed. So shake reduction or image stabilization is not necessarily going to save all your photos. Plus I was trying a bit harder to make things stable